So I just want to begin by thanking Brian, Lindy, Sarah at the Humanities Center for bringing all of us together to share our work with you and with each other today. It's also my theory that I think the most beautiful people theorize beauty, so it's really, I'm just kidding, it's a joke. So it's an honor to be with you all here. So, it's a joke. My current research project explores the various meanings and the manifestations of liberalism during the Cold War period. That's what my larger work is on, especially through the intersections of republicanism and authoritarianism under the governmental administrations of US President Lyndon B. Johnson and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos. So I argue in the project that the various collaborations between these two administrations, whether as military agreements during the Vietnam War or cultural collaborations within the broader geopolitical landscape of the global Cold War, reveal the ways that transnational politics and investments transformed Filipino-American racial subjectivity from the object of colonial conquest into the subject of a new world order. So that's a sort of larger project. So this paradigm for me offers and proposes an alternative ways to think about the function of race during the period, how these ideas about race generated a limited paradigm for thinking about decolonization, and also the other forms of subjectivity that Filipinos enacted in order to articulate their lives outside of and especially in resistance to these kinds of strictures. So a lot of my work admittedly focuses upon the regime of President Ferdinand Marcos and First Lady Imelda Marcos, these two right here. And the Marcoses ruled over the Philippines from 1965 to 1986 when they were ousted by the People Power movement in 1986. So from 1972 to 1981, the Marcoses ruled by martial law. And throughout her tenure, the First Lady actually named truth, beauty, and goodness as the central ideology for deploying her political vision in the Philippines. That was really critical for her, right? So her insistence upon truth, beauty, and goodness, for instance, ordered the eradication of Manila's unsightly slums and the impoverished masses that came with them. So what I'm going to present today is a really small portion of a chapter that I've been working on, so it's a fairly new chapter in the project, in which I analyze the ways that Imelda Marcos's theory of beauty allowed her to present a version of women's rights, which she heralded as the rise of the new Filipina, that I argue provided the ideological groundwork for incorporating Filipino women into the global market economy. So if Ferdinand Marcos, and again, these two right here, not these two, right? So Ferdinand Marcos, this guy right here, presented himself as rational, virile, and heroic. Imelda Marcos operated as his perfect counterpart, the archetypal woman. She was graceful, charming, and undeniably feminine. Now, the couple referred to themselves as malakas at maganda, which in Tagalog, it's in Tagalog, but the English translation is the strong and the beautiful. The first man and woman of the nation sprung from a bamboo tree and divinely chosen to lead the country into a new era of national greatness. I don't know if this works. Yeah, there you go. So this is the bamboo tree that he sprung from, right? So the president fashioned a version of masculinity that reinforced his strongman persona. He disseminated tales of his bravery during World War II, and he evidenced his virility with stories of his many female admirers. On the other hand, Imelda Marcos, his wife, came across as a striking presence, tall and youthful in her formal gowns, generously granting requests for songs. So one of the things she would do is if you had a song that you wanted to hear, she would just stop everything she was doing and just sing it, right? So she was that good. But biographers noted that the young Ferdinand Marcos was instantly captivated by Imelda, then Romualdez's beauty, and that the gravitas of her image became his secret weapon during the presidential campaign. Biographers also described the former beauty queen, she was a former beauty queen, she won the beauty queen of Manila, right, during her younger days, as possessing the capacity to hold the attention of distinguished statesmen from around the world. So here she is dancing with Lyndon B. Johnson. There's so many photos of her dancing with Johnson, with Reagan, with Carter, et cetera. So within this romance, the complementary union signaled a racial and sexual purity through which a new nation and a new Filipino might emerge. As the country's Adam and Eve, the couple orchestrated with their heterosexual romance the coupling of the northern and southern portions of the archipelago and the realization of national cohesion. So Imelda Marcos was from the southern portion of the Philippines, and Ferdinand Marcos was from the northern portion of the Philippines, and together they formed like national unity. Right? So here, national unity gestured toward the birth of a homogeneous Filipino race. Such articulations of Filipino raciality, conceived from the marriage of the first man and the first woman, attempted to overcome, according to the Marcoses, notions of Filipino abjection, what they call the defeatism, the sloth, the self-deprecation generally ascribed to Filipinos. So in other words, they were going to save the race. Right? So in this story of Malakas at Maganda, beauty marked the place of the feminine within the authoritarian regime and defined the division of labor that assembled what historian Primitivo Mijares described as the Marcoses' conjugal dictatorship. For instance, Filipino writer Quijano de Manila, who followed the Marcoses from the early days of Ferdinand Marcos's presidential campaign to the height of the couple's power, noted a distinct transformation between the Filipino press's articulation or the reporting of the beautiful to describe the First Lady's physicality to the First Lady's use and theorization of beauty as an instrument for identifying and organizing women's role within Philippine society, right? So it was no longer that Imelda was just beautiful, but instead she was theorizing beauty. She was using beauty as a way to kind of like think about her power. So Quijano de Manila wrote that while, quote, not so long ago, all Imelda Marcos was noted for was her beauty, the awe is armored with a hard qualifier like the iron to butterfly, end quote. So he noted, as others oftentimes did as well, that beyond simply being beautiful, the First Lady also weaponized beauty as a medium for enacting the regime's political agenda. In other words, beauty was not simply an adjective used to describe aesthetic quality, but rather an authoritarian philosophy for articulating the distinct role of women within Philippine society. Right? So in her speech at the Philippine Women's University in 1976, the First Lady introduced to her audience the idea of what she called the new Filipina, the new woman of Philippine society who would serve as the mother and the caretaker of the nation, as well as man's new partner in political affairs. So Marcos deployed beauty to articulate women's new role. She explained that the new Filipina will, and this is her exact words, because she is a woman, find time, even if it is her leisure time, to be concerned with what's beautiful. She will encourage it in every form. She will see that beauty is necessary for the soul of the nation, that is not by bread alone that man lives, right? People need beauty in their lives, ultimately. So this new Filipina emerged during a period of international conversation about women's place within global development and integration. The year before Marcos's speech in 1975, women from around the world convened in Mexico City for the first time for the first International Women's Year Conference, where Marcos herself was named as a distinguished speaker. For the First Lady, the new Filipina was an instantiation of the Philippines' commitment to the guidelines outlined by the United Nations and other international regimes of governance. So in this way, Marcos's articulation of beauty as inherent to the new Filipina was also couched in a rhetoric of national development and modernization. She advised, for instance, that in addition to being beautiful, the new Filipina must also be, quote, down to earth, practical, and industrious. So framing beauty as well as what she referred to as sympathy, tenderness, compassion, and love as women's distinct work, right, their unique work in the Philippines. Marcos tasked the new Filipina with the responsibility of communicating these ideals in the service of the national good. So Marcos also insisted that womanhood was rooted in what she called that tiny word, that slender syllable, help, right, that women should be helped, they should help others, and, quote, that womanhood of its very nature is a giving. As such, she defined women's new role as a medium of transmission between what she called the beauty of paradise and the earthly work of national development. So in this way, Marcos oftentimes used beauty as a method of instruction, what Talitha Espiritu has referred to as a therapeutic cultural policy for encouraging the masses to serve the aims of the regime. So Filipino, and I'm theorizing beauty here and kind of thinking about beauty in relation to the regime, but Filipino and other trans-Pacific feminist scholars have oftentimes and long pointed to beauty as an analytic for analyzing the role of gender in the materialization of nationalist and imperialist aspirations. Literary scholar Denise Cruz, for example, has discussed the significance of the literary figure Maria Clara as a beautiful mestiza who symbolized an emerging Filipino national identity near the end of the 19th century, which saw the fall of the Spanish Empire and the rise of the U.S. empire in the Philippines. On the other hand, Southeast Asian studies scholar Mina Rosas points to the importance of the Filipino beauty queen during the US colonial period as an expression of both patriarchal power and the emergence of a new role of national service for Filipino women. So some of my students are here and we've talked, right? We talked about the beauty queen as a really important figure in Philippine kind of cultural politics, right? So Rosas explains that the beauty queen, quote, typified the ambivalent modern woman of the times. And finally, feminist theorist Mimi Thi Nguyen has described beauty as what she calls biopower for maximizing life during times of war, describing it as an important site of signification, power, and knowledge about how to live. So here, Imelda Marcos' deployment of beauty extended these historical uses to construct a language for reimagining the role of the Filipino woman in a new era of national sovereignty. That is, Marcos's own theorization of beauty named Cold War modernity as inherently beautiful and identified women as the instrument for materializing a distinct Philippine post-colonial identity during a period of global upheaval and reconstruction. Referring to the new Filipina as what she called the eternal mother to man, Marcos described life-giving as reproductive labor that connected women's work as mothers and as caretakers to the materialization of national development. Indeed, for instance, throughout the 1970s and the 1980s, the regime constructed new export processing zones throughout the country, enacted the Labor Code of 1974, which officially institutionalized a national labor export program, a program that has just gained strength, today, right? And renewed the U.S. leases over the Subic Bay Naval Base and the Clark Air Force Base in 1979. So these economic and military structures drew upon Filipino women as a newly available workforce that could sustain the regime's commitment to a transnational politics of neoliberalism and imperialism. Sociologist Rosel Pereñas has explained that, quote, the international transfer of caretaking is a distinct form of the international division of labor in which Filipina domestic workers perform the reproductive labor or the private sphere responsibilities of class-privileged women in industrialized countries as they leave other women in the Philippines to perform their own. So Rosel Pereñas is working in the, she's a contemporary scholar, and she talks a lot about the ways that what we see as Filipina care work and Filipino domestic work all over the world is actually rooted in this politics of modernization that the Marcoses actually began, right? So Pereñas and others note that the Filipino women constituted 75% of the labor force in export processing zones by the early 1980s, and this is when the regime was still in power, and more than half of international migrants by the 1990s. So as Pereñas and others have theorized, women's care work is the non-material labor whose exportability elsewhere, whose movement elsewhere, has underlined its very value. Oh, no, there's no more slides, right? So moreover, I wish there were. So moreover, so in addition to kind of thinking about domestic work and domestic labor, the continued U.S. militarization of the Philippines evidenced as well an ongoing yet renewed U.S. interest in the Asia-Pacific as a critical site for enacting a politics of U.S. containment and quote-unquote security during the period. The steady rise of Filipino women hostesses, and I put hostesses in quotation marks, in Olongapo illustrated the proliferation of new sexual economies under the direction of U.S. military and Philippine state collaborations. Political scientists like Cynthia Enloe have discussed the ways that officials in Olongapo made invisible sex work by insisting upon recording women as what they called hostesses rather than prostitutes. So this elision of women's sexual labor illustrates the extent to which the rhetoric of Filipino women's hospitality and care, in a lot of ways their beauty, right, euphemistically occluded the gendered violence of U.S. imperialism. Additionally, cultural theorist Jin Kyung Lee writes that, she says that the import of military sex workers, mostly Filipina and Russian women, into South Korea began in the mid-1990s, in many ways following the precedent of Okinawa, where the demand for sex and sexualized labor had begun to be met by Filipinas since the mid-1970s, right, Marcos's period. The South Korean state assisted in importing women and by making legal provisions available. So ultimately what I'm trying to point out here, right, is that even though the Marcoses sort of deployed beauty as a kind of cultural rhetoric and a political rhetoric, one of the things that was underlying it, right, was that the beauty was simply a discourse that really tried to mask or try to frame differently a lot of the kind of the sexual economies of the time, the military partnerships of the time, and the kind of political and economic institutions of the time. So the work of the new Filipina was not only in her capacity to serve or be in the service of others, but especially in her ability to generate possibility for the nation. In other words, the sophistication of the regime's efforts to construct the new Filipina cohered in both the extraction of her labor and especially in the configuration of her subjectivity as exhaustively productive. Put differently, the regime aimed to reorganize women's role within the new international economic order by resetting the shape of women's empowerment through an expansiveness the size of the global economy. The coherence of new discourses of womanhood, like the First Lady's aggressive pursuit of the new Filipina, functioned to tie the Philippines to the multi-directional circuits of the transnational economy. The First Lady's conception of beauty defined Philippine modernity through the exhaustive possibilities generated by the feminine. Marcos implored women to lay claim to the affective work of nurturing the human spirit, the groundwork necessary for activating national progress, and assigned the feminine to serve as the guiding force for distinguishing the true from the deceptive, the beautiful from the repulsive, and the good from the evil. The feminine served to bridge a divide between the antiquated and the modern, the past and the present, and became the living labor for generating value from what was previously rendered invaluable. Maybe a better way to say this, right? It might be that the First Lady deployed beauty as an ideology for incorporating Filipino women into the political economy of the global market in ways that made them more susceptible to the dangers of its fluxes. As the premier figure of beauty herself, or so she believed, right? The First Lady modeled for other, I mean, she is really beautiful, right? But the First Lady modeled for other women how they might use their beauty to advance national projects. Even as Marcos articulated beauty as an abstraction, right? She sort of talked about it in a really abstract way. She constantly weaponized it as the force behind redevelopment programs. As the governor of Metro Manila, so in addition to the First Lady, she was also the governor of Metro Manila. She was the Minister of Human Settlements. She was the patroness of the arts. And all of these things allowed her to conceive of beauty as an aesthetic principle in order to administer it as an instrument of speculation and investment. For her, beauty could identify possibility, but also capitalize upon it. For instance, she tried to transform Manila into a new city of man. In order to direct massive construction projects and sanitation measures to rid the country of its human garbage, its refuse and its waste, its general unseemliness, in essence, its ugliness. She hated things that were ugly. Marcos cited Manila's squalor not only as a barrier to national development, but also as a hindrance to human progress. As such, measures sought to increase productivity by targeting its most unproductive and non-productive facets for expulsion. Marcos made beauty inextricable from capital. Or in other words, she tailored beauty as a mechanism for securing capital within the Philippines and then funneling it into the regime. So by way of conclusion, I just kind of want to point to the Marcoses. For the Marcoses, beauty acted as a marker of modernity, and it functioned in the Philippines to align the nation with the paradigms of international politics and its attendant regimes of governance. The First Lady's insistence, right, to assign beauty to the feminine had the effect of marking Filipino women's labor as a mechanism for materializing development within the country. So I'll close by offering this, that a post-colonial critique of beauty perhaps requires that beauty be consistently redefined away from any singular truth, but as a discourse, a site of cultural signification, a place where meaning is made, and especially where it's always contested. Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Antonieta Mercado, and I am a professor at the Communication Studies Department, and my students from International Media are here. Today we're discussing Mexico. And thank you, Brian Clark, for inviting me. To be honest with you, I was, when you invited me to this post-colonial notions of beauty, I was a little bit nervous. I don't work on beauty. I mean, that's the least thing I work on, right? I work on, I study in Mexico, I study in UNAM, study political science in a very westernized way, and then I did my PhD. In UCSD, my master's in communication as well in San Diego State. So I have been studying the last 15 years or so practices of communication among indigenous migrants from Mexico. And it is interesting, the politics of identity and the politics of beauty as well, right? I did an extensive study of those practices, and one of the most salient things that people will say they wanted to do was produce media, right? Indigenous migrants from Mexico, they wanted to produce media or to use any kind of media they could get a hand on to preserve their culture, to do cultural preservation. So I started as well to interrogate my own positionality. Here I am mixed, right? And a lot of we have lived in Latin America. We have had, we were the first colonized territories by Europeans 500 years ago, a little bit over 500 years ago, right? And we're not really part of the post-colonial discussion. Post-colonial discussions are mostly related to English-speaking countries that were colonized by the British Empire or by the French Empire, in the case of France Fanon, for example. And that's a very differently situated experience. So I just wanted to talk about that difference. I know about post-colonial studies. When I started learning about that, it was interesting, but it was a completely different experience that I had with coloniality, being colonized by the Spanish, right, and being independent from the Spanish Empire for 200 years, and still speaking Spanish, right, as my mother language, and instead of Nahuatl as my language should have been without colonization. So I started to explore that, and from my work and from the work that I do in the community, we do a lot of art. For those of you who know me, you have seen that with my students, I organize the Day of the Dead celebrations here on campus, and they have a lot to do with a concept from the Nahuatl culture that is called Xochichuicatl, flower and song, and that's why my slides are all full of flowers. So when I was thinking about the invitation that Brian extended to me to talk about beauty in a post-colonial way. First of all, in Latin America, we don't conceive ourselves as post-colonial. Coloniality, the practices of colonialism, are still part of the institutions. Indigenous people don't have the infrastructure yet, right? Schools and extensive cultural institutions to preserve the culture in the same way as European culture has been preserved, right? So we live within that settler state. There are some problems that we have that are very different from the problems that people in India might have, or somewhere else in Martinique, right? We have an extensive mestizaje, which was a racialized project of the states in Latin America to make people whiter, to get rid of the indigenous, right? So I know that a lot of Chicanos in the United States have gone to mestizaje, looking for their indigenous roots, right? And that's very good, because the mestizo has indigenous roots. But also for us in Latin America, mestizaje has been getting rid of the indigenous, getting whiter, right? Mejorar la raza, to better the race. That's a very common expression in Latin America, right? So even culturally, the deep roots of the culture have been hidden or obliterated or appropriated, right, by European structures. So we have erasure of systems of knowledge. We're living in settler states. We have widespread discrimination and racism. Also, I just wanted to mention some, I have a big list of authors that are talking about decoloniality, right? If you're interested knowing about them, I have a big list: Pablo González Casanova, Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui, Gladys Tzotzul, Enrique Dussel, Karina Ochoa, Nelson Maldonado, Ramon Grosfolio. It's not extensive. There's even more, right? Some of them are mestizo, like me. Some of them are indigenous. It's also a very wide variety of authors. So again, my question is decolonial or post-colonial, right? Pablo González Casanova coined a term called internal colonialism. Is that internalization of oppression? The fact that in the university I learned about Plato as the beginning of philosophy, right? Instead of Nezahualcóyotl, the poem that you just got. And I was born in a city named Nezahualcóyotl. So Nezahualcóyotl is very dear to me. I was born nearby where he was born. So there is another concept that is useful for this discussion the coloniality of power, right? The structures of control that have emerged during basically the modernization project, and many scholars, such as Enrique Dussel and Ramon Grossfogel, situated the beginning of modernization with the conquest, right? 500 years ago. That was the beginning of extensive international capitalism and basically the exploitation of a whole new continent by Europeans, right? So what it is to do, I will stop the criticism there. I just wanted to situate my knowledge and the things that I have been doing, my body of knowledge, and my person as well. But I came here to talk to you about that culture, that preservation of culture, that flower, right? The ideas of rescuing the knowledge. And I am always remember, this is a depiction of the fall of Tenochtitlan, Mexico City, right? What was known the Mexica Empire or the Aztec Empire, which is widespreadly known, although Mexicas didn't like to be called Aztecs. It was basically depicting them as outsiders, right? But this is a poet who sings a sad song, Ignoquicatl. That's a sad song about how everything was destroyed, even books, codices, and the language, a lot of the way the knowledge was preserved in the old times, right, before the conquest. So this is an anonymous poet who says, "Our only inheritance was a fishnet full of holes." So I love what we do, living in settler colonial states, being mixed already, right? At this point, 21st century, is to look back in our histories, in the indigenous communities that still preserve the language, that still speak their original languages, go back to testimonies, go back to history, and find that is a fishnet full of holes, right? And we elaborate from there. We still practice our philosophy in everyday life in conjunction with Western philosophy or Western thought, right? So we reconstruct indigenous histories, epistemologies, and spiritual thought, despite of living in colonial structures. And this is the difference. I came here to talk to you about Xochicuicatl. That's disfracismo, I don't know, it was a term coined by Ángel María Garibay. I'm looking at Kevin and Bicho, maybe they have the translation. I never found the translation, but it's basically to describe Mesoamerican and indigenous languages in the continent. There is the complexity, there is that word, double metaphors, right? So Xochicuicatl, in Xochitl is basically flower and song, right? And for you, might mean nothing, right? A flower and a song, but it's basically the looking for beauty, looking for the idea of truth through thinking, through appreciating nature, and to appreciating beauty. This is the symbol for word and flower, is the flowering word, which means poetry and philosophy, because they were not separated, right? It was the same thing. So this is the ideogram for word, and when you add a flower, then you have the disfracismo, right? The double metaphor that talks about poetry, beauty, philosophy, right? The flowering word. So flowers, explaining the double metaphor, right? In Cuicatl, or Xochicuicatl, this is in the Nahuatl language, which should be my mother language, but it's not. But anyway, the metaphor implies complex ideas. Like flowers, they evoke beauty, fragrance, pleasure, life. And the songs, they are used to convey the truth, to convey words of truth to others and to nature or divinity. So those are, this is a depiction of Tlamatine, which are philosophers or poets. But there is also a word, tlacuilo, which, because you see the language was in pictures, you had to learn how to paint in order to know how to write. So it was the same word for painter and writer, and that's why I paint. I do paint a lot. So there is another example of a disfrazismo, a double metaphor, right? This is to explain a human being, a person. And this is interesting, right? The complexity of conveying the complexity of the phrase is initially in Yolot, right? Istli is your eyes and your face. Yolot is your heart. So to be able to describe a person, you have to know that a person has awareness of you because they are looking at you and they have a face, right? But they also have an internal life, a conscious, right? And that's why this disfrazismo explains, this double metaphor explains. There's plenty of, I was making a list of those, and then this morning I decided, no, I don't want to bore you. There's plenty of those expressions, right, in philosophical thought, in Nahuatl. So that's what it is, right? The vitality, your heart inside. So this is the poem that I passed to you in 3 languages. And this is, there's some poems that are collective and others that are anonymous that come from different sources. The fishnet full of holes, right? A lot of the sources that we have for this thought come from Bernal Diaz del Castillo in the Florentine Codes, right? Basically, Bernal Diaz del Castillo, who was a Spaniard, asked indigenous people to write down these issues. So this is Nezahualcóyotl who lived. He was not Aztec. Usually he's depicted as an Aztec poet. He was not. He was a Colhua. He spoke Nahuatl as well, which was a lingua franca at the time, along with the Mayan. And he basically expresses this idea of flower and song, right? If you have it, is what will I take with me when I die? Will I leave anything mine on earth? Will my heart be moved to action while I am here? Is that all in vain when we sprout and live on this earth? We should leave behind at least some flowers. We should leave behind at least some songs. So the teachers will exactly teach that to their disciples, to create songs, to create works of beauty, and leave that behind. Live your life creating beauty, right? In the name of Xochitl. How long do I have? 2 minutes? 3 minutes? I'm up? Oh, okay. So this is Xochipilli, the deity of creators, right? He's depicted as a young boy in ecstasies, probably having taken some mushrooms and flowers. Yeah, he's surrounded. Yes, he's surrounded by tobacco, flower, and also another of the ideas is to dream, right? To get into a state of dreaming or ecstasies, so you imagine beautiful things like embroideries or things to express yourself. So, what else? Another idea is that I'm only talking about the Nahuatl culture. I'm not talking about other cultures. There are about 68 different indigenous groups in Mexico. I will hope that someday I will do a comparative analysis, but this is something that people think is that indigenous people didn't have a philosophical system of knowledge because everything was destroyed, right? You come to a place, destroy the books, and then accuse the person that, oh, you don't have any culture because I just burned your books. But there was a universal, at least with the Aztecs, it was and the Toltecas was a universal schooling system for nobility, the Calmecac, and for everybody else, the Tepozcali. And in those schools, right, universities or liberal arts college, the system of knowledge about flower and song was taught to disciples. And the teachers will be depicted as helping others to develop their own face and a true heart. That was the purpose of a philosopher and a teacher and a instructor, a person who had knowledge about this system of creating beauty right? So the LaMattina is depicted here as uttering words to his disciples, right? There are some pictures of women too. I don't think women as LaMattina. I don't think I put them here. I had them in my phone. Anyway, just to close the discussion, some of the contemporary ideas. This is the image of the central part of the university where I studied when I was in Mexico, where I get my college degree. Some of the ideas are reflected in public art, and of course it has been used, right, appropriated by the state and by the market to talk about ideas like Josen was talking about the state in Philippines, right, appropriating the notions of beauty to deploy issues of power. The same thing has happened in Mexico, but in some ways, in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America, right, and Mesoamerica, Central America, Mexico, the United States, where native people had inhabited. So there are some depictions of this idea, right? The appreciation of beauty, the public appreciation of beauty as a form of creation and as a form of representation, right? Very sort of grounded. Again, this idea of Xochichuicat is expressed as in the poem of Netzahualcoyotl, right? Reflection about death, about what are you going to leave, and of course has a lot to do with the Day of the Dead celebration, right? In the philosophical meaning of death. So it's a question of what are the flowers that you left in this world? What are the ideas? What is the beauty that you created and left? This is another building in Mexico City by Siqueiros. It's called the Poliforum Cultural Siqueiros, also very painted by one of the muralists. And this is practices of resurgence of contemporary indigenous poets. Natalia Toledo, she's a Zapotec poet, and they're using media, right? They're using these practices, coming back to practices of communication. They're using media to deploy these ideas of this philosophical thought about the good life, about creating truth through beauty and Xochichuicat. That's it.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And thank you, Brian, to inviting me. As Antonieta, I was also very surprised to be invited to participate in this panel because my research is not really dealing with beauty, but contemporary African theater. But at the same time, I realized I have a lot of things to think about, and I have a lot of thoughts about postcolonial critiques on beauty and on my just everyday life. And so I decided, it's actually a good opportunity to share with everybody, the little things I've been thinking. And that's why my talk is, the title is a little bit provocative on purpose. Can Black people's hair cease to be political? And so we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about hair. And so the Eurocentric ideals of beauty has influenced Black hair through modern history. A lot of Black people have internalized the social message that good hair means having hair or hairstyles that looks like white people's straight hair. Black people are told to cut their hair or pressure to straighten it. This is something that is often in print on a lot of them since birth, when their mothers chemically process their hair as soon as it's long enough for girls, or tend to shave the boy's head on a regular basis. When comedian and actor Chris Rock's daughter asked him, "Daddy, how come I don't have good hair?" referring to her perfectly healthy coil black hair, which is very typical in Black communities, he decided to make a documentary called Good Hair, directed by Jeff Stilson in 2009. Maybe you saw it or heard of it. Chris Rock's documentary takes purposely a light-hearted approach on a serious topic. Rock discovers that for some Black women, attaining good hair means either straightening, meaning using chemical products such as hair relaxer, despite the risk of scalp burns, or using extensions by integrating artificial or someone else's natural hair to your hair. He interviewed a large number of celebrities like Maya Angelou, Nia Long, Eve, Raven Simone, Sally Richardson, Kerry Washington, and more. But also black men like Ice-T at the barbershop, and they discussed their experiences with their own hair. Rock also interviewed stylists and hair care industry business people, giving an insight not only into the cultural issues, but also the economic aspects. The documentary reminds that black hair is a 9 billion industry. However, very few businesses owned by African American benefit from it. Overall, Chris Rock's message in this documentary concludes that beauty has more to do with what is inside of you than what you wear on your head. This classic rhetoric was still a very positive message that Rock sent to the black communities, in my opinion. But he missed the opportunity to really dig into the intimate relationship between aesthetics and politics and how to question it. A postcolonial critique of the Eurocentric beauty standard is a bit missing, I think, in this documentary. It's in another documentary released a year later in 2010 called My Nappy Roots, A Journey Through Black Heritage, play words, by Regina Kimball and Jay Blanc, that we found this postcolonial critique. Kimball and Blanc documentary is not entertaining and funny as the one by Chris Rock, but they addressed more directly the struggle of African American people in their search for social control, identity, and economic independence. The cultural movement Black is Beautiful that was started in the US in the 60s by African American asserted that black people's natural hair was beautiful just the way it grew. Everybody must have in mind, of course, famous pictures and video of Angela Davis, big afro, that symbolized, Black is Beautiful movement. But Black is Beautiful came out of the Black Power movement and infiltrated the American cultural mainstream in the adoption of the Afro hairstyles and Afrocentric fashion. In other words, blackness became the symbol of being cool. Being cool in popular music, films, and advertising in the 60s and the 70s. I think it's important to make the distinction between cool and beautiful. Black is beautiful is not the message the media is selling. With some exception, of course, like the French fashion designer, I don't know if you know Jean-Paul Gaultier, who has always featured a diverse cast of models, including dark-skinned women purposely in his shows since the 80s. So, but there are some exceptions like him. The image that the media is actually selling is the lighter black people get, the closer they become to white people, and the better it is. It's the same situation with hair. Black hair becomes acceptable and beautiful the more it gets close to white people's hair in terms of texture and style. An example of that is in 1917, the Kenyan and Mexican actress Lupita Nyongo, who publicly criticized on social media women's magazine Grazia that altered image of her hair. Let's see. The magazine digitally removed part of her natural hair on the November cover to fit a more Eurocentric notion of beauty, accused the actress. She posted on Twitter a before And after a photograph that to prove her point, as you can see, that was originally the shooting where you can clearly see her curly hair, on the back. And the magazine just decided, it's too African, or we don't really want to have this hair going on over here, and they'll really make something completely different. Even her hair here, more smooth and looking more like straight hair. Black is Beautiful movement in the 60s and the 70s fought against the erasure of black culture and the assimilation to Eurocentric norms. Quite interestingly, Black Lives Matter movement today sounds like a revival of Black is Beautiful, with a more global approach and an inclusiveness twist, I would say. Black Lives Matter define themselves on their website by these words, I quote, "Global network that is chapter-based, member-led organization whose mission is to build local power and to intervene in violence inflicted on Black communities by the state and vigilance. We are expansive. We are a collective of liberators who believe in an inclusive and spacious movement," end of quote. I should clarify that the inclusiveness discussed here is about a minority group within the large minority group within the large minority meaning Black and people of color identify as women, trans people, and also queer. Black Lives Matter and Black is Beautiful teach both the importance of self-love in the Black communities. At the same time, they address the systemic violence of racism and Eurocentric values that discriminate minorities, in particular Black people and other people of color. Black is Beautiful continues to deliver a very powerful message crossing aesthetics and politics. However, their emphasis of the word natural hair can seem challenging or even misleading in 2018. Indeed, in our modern times, few people of any ethnicity wear completely natural hair. White women and women of other ethnicity get permanents to curl their hair very often or straighten their hair with a flat iron without causing any controversy. Does the discourse advocating for natural hair as the most beautiful, preferable choice confine Black and people of color into a political statement that does not allow them to do whatever they want with their hair? I start locking my hair more than 15 years ago. Yeah, 15 years ago when I was right after high school, and it was not really because I was trying to make a political statement. It was just because to me dreadlocks hairstyles was, and at that time and still today, a very beautiful hairstyle. It's a beautiful aesthetic. And I end up several years of practice to straighten my hair or use extensions at the end of high school. But it was more for aesthetic reason, not for because I was trying to make a political statement. I think I like the commitment it takes to wear dreadlocks. Locks cannot be unlocked. When you have dreadlocks and decide to adopt a different hairstyle, you need to cut your hair completely and start over. And I think I really like this type of commitment it takes to have dreadlocks. And this might be probably the reason why I consider my locks as part of my identity. My locks became, I should say, political, not by choice, but by necessity. Because because of how they were perceived by society and people of any ethnicity. In Western countries where I grew up and where I live, so I was born and raised in Paris, in France, and now I live in the US. Locks are, in my opinion, locks are either rejected and discriminated against because they are perceived as dirty or unprofessional look. And I can give you an example of a friend of mine seeking to work, as a public figure in a very big company in France. And he was giving the alternative to either cut his dreadlocks because he didn't look professional enough, or search for a new job. That's what his boss told him. Or the alternative is locks are seen as an exotic, beautiful, and intriguing sight that white people feel entitled to touch without consent. And I could spend the next 2 hours sharing personal anecdotes about this. I will just give you one. This Saturday, I celebrated with my wife our first year anniversary. So it was very romantic. Thank you. We were at I don't know if you know the hornblower, the hornblower night dinner cruise things. So it was pretty interesting. And I mean, it was actually really nice. I shouldn't say that. It was actually really nice. We have a lot of fun dancing and doing different things over there. So I was waiting for her at the restroom, and there's this white woman who came out of nowhere, and she's just started complimenting my hair. She was so enthusiastic. I was almost embarrassed because, people were still around, and she was just like, "Oh, it's so beautiful," and "Oh, I love your hair and the length," and is it your real hair? And, and asking different things, different questions. And she asked me if she can touch my hair. And without even receiving consent, she touched my hair. She pulled all her fingers like this in my hair and said, "Oh, it's beautiful." And it's not the first time. I have so many stories like that where people just touch my hair without consent. And it's interesting because I don't know. I was a little bit when she did that. I was looking at her you would think in this type of environment, in a boat where everybody is very dressed up and acting civilized, that they will know better. But no, she was just all over, and just because she thought it was beautiful, she thought she was entitled to just touch my hair without my consent. And actually, I was going to tell her she could touch my hair, but she didn't even wait for my response. And that's the type of situation and scenario that a lot of people who has dreadlocks run into. When I travel to sub-Saharan African countries, people congratulate me for choosing to keep my natural hair and taking good care of my locks. Their compliments remind me how not too long ago, actually, in many African countries, dreadlocks used to be considered negatively as bad or poor aesthetic choice because it was associated with homeless and people with mental disease who could not take care of their hair. In Barbados, that is an island populated by black people in majority, most of women wear different natural hairstyles, which makes me feel delightfully invisible each time I'm there, and I love that. But I have also noticed some conventional ways to wear natural hair over there and in professional settings, especially when you go there. So it's really interesting because when you go to Barbados, to me, it's quite overwhelming because even in when I go to African countries, I do not see a majority of people wearing natural hair. Like they have like a lot of different type of hairstyles, but people have extensions, hair, I mean, everything, you know, like anything aesthetic, you know. And in Barbados, really, like you have also a lot of hairstyles, but like I haven't seen anyone when I visit wearing artificial or extension, or like they all have natural hair. But at the same time, it's also very, when you go to the bank or different places like professional settings, it's really, really neat, you know, dreadlocks, or it's not like the Bob Marley style, you know, you will have, it's really like people have a sort of and I'm not sure if we can call that censorship or something, but there's a sort of a way they allow themselves to have their natural hair in a very neat way. And I was always intrigued by that because, I mean, my hair sometimes looks like neat, but many times they don't, and it's okay. I do not, you know, obsess over that. But that's something I noticed, and I've been to Barbados many times. But I'm open to the conversation about that if some of you have opinions or ideas about, you know, about that. So in the US, locks became a popular fashion in the mid-'80s, where each locks would be groomed to look uniform in size and length, as you can see with celebrities such as Whoopi Goldberg, Lenny Kravitz, Lauryn Hill, and Tracy Chapman, for example. Before them, the iconic figures of dreadlocks was, of course, Jamaican singer Bob Marley since the 70s. Today, the styles has gone through another representation thanks to variations such as sister locks, goddess locks, or faux locks. It's very popular, people wearing faux locks. In conclusion, I would say I'm in favor of letting Black people and any other ethnicity choose whatever hairstyle they want with the freedom to make an aesthetic statement over a political one. At the same time, I do think it's essential to critically analyze the social prejudice, the system of privilege in societies, and the context for the possibility to perform freely an aesthetic beyond politics. I'm going to end my talk by inviting you to look at some works by a young artist from Ivory Coast. Her name is Leticia Key, and she's becoming very famous. Maybe you run into articles about her in the social media, but she's becoming very famous by taking Black hair to a new level of conversation in arts and politics. And she uses her hair to shape her thoughts, and I think it's quite remarkable the way she does it. And I have a big crush on her, so I just want to share that with you. I told my wife she's okay with that. So I just really like the way she used her whole hair to create art, and also making political statements. Like, she's really combining aesthetics and politics. And like, for instance, here you can see, like, she's trying to address the issue of sexual harassment and the Me Too movement in that sense. Also, she indicates in interviews by seeing this man pulling the woman dress to look at under. So she has like tons of pictures like that where, like French book, she only speaks French. And she also addressed gun violence, by doing stuff like that with her hair, or the future of Africa, like how can we, having discussion about that. And so, there's like a lot of pictures, and if you are interested, I really encourage you to check it out, because she has really interesting arts. But what I like is really also about her freedom of not necessarily being trapped by the politics about hair, that really tend to to be, I don't know, very typical for Black and people of color, but she's really using the aesthetic and the politics at the same time. And I think we should have the freedom to do that. So thank you.
I thank you, but thank you all for staying this long. I hope this doesn't sound like a class. What I really want to share with you is I'm a literature professor, but having to teach post-colonial theory in my classes has taught me a lot about the importance of how to teach it through art. And so what I want to share with you today are the theorists that have been very important to shaping my way of thinking about how to teach post-colonial studies, especially in undergraduate, because usually you study it in graduate school. I'm also going to show you faces of the theorists that have influenced me, because it's very important to give them visibility. We know a lot of faces of maybe Blake or something, but maybe not so much Fanon, Said, and other people. So put very simply, colonialism was the practice whereby an outsider group believed so firmly in their cultural superiority that they forced all their essential cultural character on the insider, undoing and reshaping one world in exchange for another. In this way, colonialism is a very general term that refers to the creation of a new world order starting in the 1400s, in which 4 European nations had colonies in every continent except Antarctica, only because the technology couldn't work there. And they controlled 85% of the world's human population and resources for roughly 400 years until 1975. I don't know why France is not here, but France was a huge colonial force. Maybe the French made this map, I'm not sure. But this is just a beautiful map to show you how the ocean was used and how extensive the trade route was. This is for Brian, this is the British. It's just a joke. So we can also think of colonialism this way, that over 4 continuous centuries, complex, diverse, thriving societies were forced to speak, eat, behave, copulate, pray, and think according to 4 European traditions. While weapons and other brutal objects were obviously used to subject people, the Martinican theorist Frantz Fanon explains that the only way to fully comprehend colonialism's success is to appreciate the power of symbolism and signification in enacting daily and ordinary acts of epistemic violence, internalized into the mind and spirit of the colonized, and which, once begun, will continue to inflect the next generations. So taking from this, Kenyan poet and novelist Lupita Nyongo calls the work of a post-colonial artist a project in decolonizing the mind, in the creation of new ways of seeing. Importantly for him, it's a lens, not an ideology, that unthinks Eurocentrism, even though it sees it as indispensable. It is pointed inward so as to deconstruct the frameworks by which formerly colonized societies were forced to see themselves, more beast than human, more savage than cultured, more heathen than enlightened. It is also pointed outward in the hope of creating a new vocabulary and framework for societies who have been politically free for only 50 years, today that is, and who cannot see themselves without lingering traces of the colonial culture hardwired into their very genetics, architecture, educational system, language, religion, fashion, and so much more. Post-colonial artistic expression thus reorients the colonizing gaze towards the subaltern perspective, which reads history from below. Oh, what happened to my picture of, excuse me, it's out of order. The word subaltern is actually taken from a Sardinian political theorist, Antonio Gramsci, from his prison book notebooks. And the subaltern for him requires us to shift our gaze to focus on the efforts of those who refuse to be silenced by the dominant ideology. Subaltern meaning seeing from below. One interpretation of post-colonialism, I didn't know this painting existed, but my student defied my order and went to Wikipedia to search the term, and she found this painting for me. So I really want to thank her here, but she's graduated, but in spirit I thank her. So this is the picture that Wikipedia uses to capture post-colonialism. It's a painting that's called The Motherland and Her Dependent Colonial Offspring. I skipped something, I'm sorry. So here, Europe is a supreme mother. She appears fatigued from feeding her teeming and insatiable infants. That would be the colonies. The reality of outright robbery and genocide is turned on its head, so that empire's increasing appetite for and dependence on the free labor, aggravated land grab, and natural resources of the colonies is concealed and coded. So the idea of beauty in the post-colonial context is very complex and problematic, because beauty in the colonial context meant very specific things that did not include colonial bodies or philosophies. Throughout colonialism, colonial bodies were exhibited in human zoos to demonstrate their utter difference from white colonial bodies. I didn't bring those images to spare you, that's kind of horrific actually. Colonial music is noise that did not correlate with the symphonic harmonies of European classical music. Artistic expression or language considered illegible hieroglyphics or scribblings that look nothing like the masterpieces that were framed and that adorned the interiors of manor halls and churches. When post-colonial theories first started entering academic jargon in the 70s and 80s, they all looked to this one book by Edward Said called Orientalism, in which he defined the Orientalism as the practice and ideology by which the East or the Oriented was constructed through social media of the time. This is the original painting of Said's book. It's an 1880 painting by the French painter J.L. Jerome. It's called Snake Charmer. And it emblematizes Said's critical point that an entire machine of musicians, philosophers, painters, novelists, poets, and many more sort of this kind of makers of signifiers projected the Orient as the irreducible other to the Occident, thus denying Eastern worlds their own centers of reference. As Said suggests, you would look at paintings such as this, and perhaps you will have the desire to rescue this pubescent boy, clearly being subjected to a kind of child labor, risking his own life with a poisonous snake for the entertainment of an audience huddled on the floor. His nakedness amplifies the dangerous difference of a world in which faces are shrouded and masked, and which everyone cannot let go of spear or sword. His nakedness shining brightly at us from the center of the canvas also exposes the agenda behind such paintings. Arabians need help before it's too late, and it will come, no surprise, through Western intervention in the form of schools, hospitals, and missionaries. The so-called exotic East was projected in canvases such as these, in which tropes of nakedness, danger, and occultism exaggerate by contrast. Ideas of the West as the exalted center of the modern world, the epitome of the human condition, beginning in the 14th century with the European Renaissance. We always think of this period as the beginning of the modern era, and indeed, Europe at that time invented a new kind of humanism. But it's not a coincidence that in those same years, every advance made in European centers was facilitated one way or another through the acquisition of more territories, more human labor, and more natural resources from everywhere outside of the European center. Can I know the time? Because maybe I need to skip the whole section. 5:15. Okay. I think that it's more important for me to go to my last artist, so I'm just going to have you look at this. This is a painter from Trinidad. He has this, he uses the black body as the ship to emphasize the fact that we don't think enough about the bodies inside the ship. If you ever look at colonial archives, it's all about the ship, you know, the greatness of the ship, the layout of the ship. So he wants us to remember the body. And by thinking about the castaways 2006 and ongoing, he wants us to connect the legacy of slavery with today's human trafficking of refugees, which is what we see in Europe happening today. Just to say a few words about this, his whole project is about how the fine art was not seen as coming out of the Caribbean. So his whole project has been how to redefine what fine art itself means. He says that in Caribbean schools, the interior walls of classrooms and clinics were painted brown in the bottom to hide the stain of human handprints. And so that is exactly the kind of grime I wanted, he says. He cleaned out his oven, collected the oily soot, and mixed it with charcoal. This is my pigment. As readers looking from below, these are the pictures, our task is to wrestle with both acts of creation. The one in which a colonizing power gives itself the right to consider whitewashed walls precious, and allows the briefest of margins for the inclusion of the bodies of children and the infirmed. We also have to wrestle with Kozier's project, whose artwork situates scum and dirt, which is how he was always seen in his schools, at the very center and elevate them into the realm of fine art. I'm going to skip. So this is the last artist I want to share with you. It's the Palestinian cartoonist Najim Salim al-Ali, an outspoken critic of Arab regimes and Israeli occupation. This is a tribute to him. Al-Ali moved to Lebanon with his family after the 1948 Palestinian exodus, referred to as Nakba, which means catastrophe or cataclysm, and he spent most of his childhood in refugee camps. In 1975, he created Handala, which means the refugee child. And this figure became the symbol of the Palestinian people's fight for self-determination. Since its creation, Handala has come to embody what Al-Ali insists is the corrective lens offered when one looks through the eyes of a Palestinian refugee who stands witness, because that's all they can do against the huge machines and settlements that Israel has to offer in counterattack. In the words of the cartoonist, "The child Handala is my signature. I presented him to the poor and named him Handala as a symbol of bitterness. I drew him as a child who is not beautiful. His hair is like the hair of a hedgehog who uses his thorns as a weapon. Handala is not a fat, happy, relaxed, or pampered child. He is barefooted like the refugee camp children, and he is an icon that protects me from making mistakes. Even though he is rough, he smells of amber. His hands are clasped behind his back as a sign of rejection at a time when solutions are presented to us the American way." Handala was born 10 years old, and he will always be 10 years old. At that age, I left my homeland, and when he returns, Handala will still be 10, and only then will he start growing up. Al-Ali shifts our attention so that we learn from the perspective of a figure typically viewed as excess or trash, nationless and homeless, humanizing and elevating him without, however, submitting him to Eurocentric romanticizations. Naji al-Ali was never able to return to Palestine. On 22nd of July in 1987, he was assassinated in London in broad daylight on the street outside the Kuwaiti newspaper office he worked for. Just last year, after 31 years of inertia, the British police decided to reopen the case to finally track down and identify those responsible for the silencing of Palestine's most outspoken art activists. Contrary to expectation, art from the postcolonial world cannot simply reject and overthrow the inherited epistemologies of colonialism, in which universalisms about the human condition in reality spoke to the smallest percent of the human population. Asking us to look anew, this art is not about a radical erasure of the past, which would be reenacting the colonizers' imperative. Rather, postcolonial artistic expression asks us to reimagine the past in collective terms, starting from below, creating new plateaus in a broader, more equitable horizon in which everyone's humanity may rise. Thank you.